All right, thank you. Hello and welcome. I'm Helen Dulac, the Public Education Manager for the North Texas Municipal Water District. And I am excited to be here today because even though it's raining, the North Texas Municipal Water District is still providing water, wastewater, and solid waste services to over 2 million people in 10 counties in North Texas. Conserving water is really important in North Texas, especially during our hot, dry summers. And I'm going to ask everyone to mute, but and so we've teamed up, NTMWD has teamed up with expert speakers on this series on virtual classes to help you have a healthy landscape while using our most precious resource, water, wisely. As a thank you, we are having a garden toolkit giveaway. If you're in the live Zoom session and you want to be entered into the drawing, please send me a direct message with your name and email address. One of the people who sends me their name and email will be randomly selected to win a garden toolkit. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the North Texas Municipal Water District's YouTube page. And so if we go long or you need to leave early, please look for the replay there. Out of respect for our presenter, please keep your mic muted, and if you want to, your video off to conserve bandwidth. Our speaker is really looking forward to answering your questions, so please type those into the chat. I will monitor the chat and ask our speaker questions after the presentation. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce Brad Voss. Brad is the County Extension Agent for Horticulture with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension in Collin County. In this role, he provides research-based information and educational programs to residents, landowners, and horticultural producers in Collin County. He holds a bachelor's degree with honors in agricultural sciences and an MS in agricultural sciences from Texas A&M University Commerce. His specialties are soil science, which is what we're here about today, and fertility, plant nutrition, and integrated pest management. So Brad, why don't you share the screen and get us started?
All right, Helen, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Welcome, everybody. Something I need to add to my bio. I need to add soil nerd to that because I always tell people that. So why don't I just add it to the bio? But thanks, everybody, for joining us. I am absolutely looking forward to helping you fall in love with your soil. Welcome to February, hence all the fun, jazzy hearts that we've added here. But I'm going to use this as an opportunity to introduce you to earth-kind soil management. So, few learning objectives as we go through this. By the end of this presentation, I would love for you guys to be able to understand why the earth-kind approach to landscape management is so highly recommended. I want you to understand the value of fully finished plant-derived compost, understand why expanded shale can be beneficial in heavy clays. I want you to understand the value of year-round organic mulch, and I want you to understand these key earth-kind practices to adopt. Now, something else for you guys to keep in mind as we go through here. Healthy roots equal healthy plants. Anybody who's heard me present before, I bring that up an awful lot because we don't need to lose track of that. Healthy roots equal healthy plants. Unhappy roots equal dead plants. And that's a common problem here in North Texas. You need to unlock your soil's potential. And our soils have a lot of potential. And then you need to understand right plant, right place. Wrong plant, dead plant. That's another good rule of thumb. So let's do some word association real quick. We are thinking about our wonderful heavy clay soils of North Texas. And I thought about this last night. And I just started thinking about what words leap to mind while I'm thinking of clay soils. And y'all, if any of these, stick out in your mind, feel free to tell us about that. Because some of these have definitely been used in emails that I received. That big red one, I hear that one a lot. And then good for nothing, low down mess. I think I might have used that one myself before. Another fun activity that I like to do is if I had a nickel for every time I heard these, this soil is awful. Yes, it can be, but it doesn't always have to be. I can't grow anything in this dirt. Not true. This soil is a soggy mess. Right now it is. Go outside. Holy smokes. We're talking about soil moisture on a day where everything's flooded. I've never tested my soil because there's no point. Also not true. Plants hate this soil. They just keep dying. No, some plants love it here. As my colleague who's in the picture, clearly demonstrating what a dead plant looks like. The things that love it here grow like the dickens. The things that don't like it here die. So again, that right plant, right place. Our pH is too high. Plants won't like it. No, certain plants won't like it. And again, that's an example of a wrong plant, right place. And then why do I even try? Folks, we've all been there. I'm a gardener just like you guys are. And yeah, sometimes that last one is the hardest question of all to answer. And I'm going to help work that out for us today. So right off the bat, what is soil? Well, my soil professor would tell you it's not dirt, because dirt's what you track into your mama's house. But soil is a dynamic natural medium composed of mineral and organic solids, gases, liquids, and living organisms, which can serve as a medium for plant growth. So let's break that down for a minute. It's dynamic. It's natural. It's made of organic solids. It's got gases and liquids, which means there's got to be some space in that soil, because that place has got those things have to be somewhere. Living organisms, again, you need space. Your soil, not only is your soil alive, but you've got to have a place for those living organisms to reside in. And of course, we can grow things in it. All those components make up what a soil is. Is a dead, lifeless soil soil? No, soil's got living organisms in it. And we're going to talk a lot about some of those critters because they are very, very, very beneficial. They're a critical part of managing heavy clay soils. Well, what's a clay soil in the first place? You've heard you have a clay. It's probably, if anybody's moved to the area, it's probably one of the first things you hear. We have clay here. Your house is going to dance around. But what that means is that's your soil texture. Sand, silt, and clay, those are your soil texture triangle on the left-hand side. And you'll notice there's lots of different names on it. Clay, sandy clay, silty clay, clay loam. Sure, many of you have heard of a loam, heard sandy loam is the best thing ever. I've heard about sandy loam. I've never met her before, but I look forward to it. The whole loam family I want to see at some point. But we have three mineral soil particles. That's sand, silt, and clay. And that's based upon size. Sand being the biggest, clay being the smallest, and silt being also very small, but not as small as clay. And if you follow the link down below, that YouTube link, you can actually see a video on how to estimate your soil texture by feel. And it is pretty much what you would think it is. You get a handful of it wet and you squeeze it between your thumb and finger and you determine what it feels like. So sand is loose and single grained. We've all made sand castles at some point. Hopefully, if you haven't, I'm sorry for you and I encourage you to do it. It's fun. Silt will feel smooth, like flour. I need to add that to the slide. Feels a bit like flour. And when you get it wet, unlike flour, it doesn't get sticky. Clay is very sticky when you get it wet. And when you squeeze it between your thumb and forefinger, you'll actually be able to form a ribbon. It's the reason that we can make pots and other ceramics from clay. All right. Now that's great. We have clay. Learn to love it. Get used to it. It's there. Some of you that don't have clays, good for you. Don't gloat. But for those of us that have clays, accept it. Focus on that soil structure. Soil structure is the arrangement of the various soil particles. Ideally, that's about 50% solids and 50% pore space. Ideally. Right now, it's mostly water in that pore space. Also, we're now including organic matter. I should have bolded organic matter because that's a big deal. That's sort of the key to unlocking our soil's potential, but we'll get there. Understand that plants need pore space to thrive. That pore space is what provides space for water and air. Plant roots need both. All right. If you have nothing but water, they suffocate and die. If you have nothing but air, you have no water to take up nutrients. Sometimes we lose sight of this. Healthy roots, healthy plants, guys. That's our soil. That pore space provides habitat for soil microbes. Something simple, but sometimes we overlook it. It's also the space where our plant roots grow. Our soils here in North Texas can be so hard. Remember, concrete was one of the ugly words I had posted up there. Our soils can be so hard that plant roots can't burrow through. Unhappy roots, unhappy plants. So why are clay soils so hard to manage? Well, it's not just us. It's sort of the Blackland Prairie as a whole. And that Blackland Prairie stems from Oklahoma down through our area of Texas. And I think sort of dead ends around San Antonio. They're all pretty challenging. They dance around a lot. They have a high shrink swell potential. So what that means is when they're wet, they stay wet. When they're dry, they stay dry. And when they're moving between the two, they move around an awful lot. Understand that poorly managed clay soils can actually sort of seal off water. Not only can they crust on the top, so your infiltration rate is very low, which infiltration is water moving into the soil. Look outside, infiltration rates are very low right now. But actually movement through our soils, which is percolation, is also very slow. So our soils can sort of crust over on the top, and you wind up with a higher runoff potential because you have excess water. It can't make its way into the soil, so it just flows off the top, carrying particles, carrying pesticides, carrying oils, carrying whatever away. I'll talk a little bit more about soil water. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but managing soil water in North Texas is probably the biggest challenge. It really is the biggest challenge. Also understand that not all plants like clays and their properties. Right plant, right place. You can't simply drop any plant, whether, if you've moved here, some of the things, depending on how far you're moving from, you might not be able to move those same plants that you've grown up with or you've always loved to our clay soils and expect them to work that way. All right. We have a unique area. It could be challenging, but it's not impossible. All right. Soil water behavior. So soils and heavy clays, and we do have a heavy, sticky clay here. It's the kind of soil that when it's wet, you walk across it and you wind up about 4 inches taller by the time you're across it than when you started, and your feet weigh about 6 pounds. So think of heavy clays like a stack of paper plates, unlined stack of paper plates. And if you were to pour a big pitcher of water over the top of that stack of paper plates, that's like the rainstorm we had last night. Where's the majority of that water going to go? It's going to splash off the top. It's going to flow off down the sides. It's going to wind up on the floor, but it's not going to make its way through that stack of plates, is it? Our clays like to form sheets, and they settle very, very, very tightly. Remember that slide where it says we can seal off water? Well, that can happen down within the soil profile as well. So you wind up, as with the picture there on the right-hand side, this hard clay layer that water simply cannot make it through. Guess what? Plant roots aren't going to make it through that heavy layer either. Okay. Now, over time, remember these plates are unlined. Some of the water that's sitting on top, that's pooled on top, is going to soak through that plate. It's going to take a long, long time. That's like our very slow infiltration rates. So what we need to try to do through adding compost and expanded shale, or just compost, is we're trying to cut those paper plates up. We want to add more pathways for water to make its way down into our soil. Once it's in our soil, we can put it to work for us. And that's a big boon of our clay soils. They hold a ton of water. Guys, they hold too much water certain times of the year. But that water holding capacity, that's a big boon for us when it's August and we still have green yards because we have good root systems. We have leaves on trees because we've got plants that can tap into that water that we've been storing all spring. All right. So we'll get to that. Now let's talk about sandy soils, just in case there's a unicorn in here that's living on some sandy soils. Understand, sandy soils are the far other end of the spectrum. They drain extremely fast. They have a very poor water holding capacity, which presents its own problems. Water not only infiltrates quickly into sandy soils, it percolates quickly. So I think of it like a straight shot. You pour water into a sand, it's going to shoot straight through it. It's going to take everything with it. Nutrients, so fertilizers you put down, pesticides. So with that, you have to understand you have a very poor nutrient holding capacity. Clays have a high nutrient holding capacity. Think of your soil as a big nutrient warehouse. So all of your, any fertilizers, any plant nutrients, water, that's stored in your soil so that plants can use it. Feed your soil and it will feed your plants. The magic weapon is still compost because it's going to act like a sponge, not only for water, but also for those plant nutrients. Hope you're starting to see a theme with organic matter here because it is the key. Now let's touch on some quick don'ts with clay soils. Number one, please do not amend with sand. It doesn't always happen, but it can. Sometimes adding sand to a clay soil is like adding rebar to concrete. And our soils are hard enough without adding a supporting structure to that. So please do not add with sand. It doesn't bring much to the game. It doesn't add any nutrition. And when it goes wrong, it goes disastrously wrong. Please avoid working wet clay soils. Now that can be difficult. I've often heard our soils referred to as 15 minutes soils, which means you've got about 15 minutes from when they're too wet to work and to too dry. But we do the best we can. So try not to work them when they're wet. Please avoid driving or walking on wet clay soils. Now, look, I'm not telling you you can't drive across your own front lawn. I'm not here to judge you, but I don't recommend it. What I'm more thinking of is if you're going to bust out your riding lawnmower, maybe go walk on your yard a little bit and feel how spongy it is. Because if you're trying to mow and it's too wet, that's compacting our soils. And we have enough compaction problems as is. And that's the goal, is to minimize compaction when we can. Along with that, try to minimize tillage as much as possible. So if you're a home gardener, I understand those soils are going to be worked more than a lawn, or should be at least. But try to minimize breaking the soil structure that you already have in place as much as you can. Plant roots are wonderful soil structure builders, but every time we till, we break that up and we allow our clays to resettle. So minimize tilling when you can. And then the last one is don't overwater. And I know that sounds simple. It's not particularly. It takes a little bit of figuring out what that means. But the easy way to do that is just check your soil moisture before watering. You can use a moisture meter, which mine costs, I think, 12 or 13 bucks off the internet. Or you have your analog moisture meter, which is your finger, and you just tell whether or not your soil is wet before you water. Our soils hold a ton of water. Believe me, guys, they do. What we need to do is, as plant folks, is you need to focus on growing healthy roots, healthy, deep roots that can tap into that water when we need it during drought conditions. Okay. So let's talk about some of these amendments that I've already mentioned. Number one is compost, and that's high quality, fully finished plant-derived compost. What I classify, or AgriLife Extension classifies as high quality, fully finished plant-derived compost, doesn't have large chunks of undecomposed materials in it. It's not going to look like mulch. If it looks like mulch, it probably is mulch. Don't use it as compost. It should be dark in color. Really shouldn't smell like much of anything. If it does, maybe that sort of slight earthy smell. And when you rub it between your hands, high quality compost should leave a thin film of humus in the cracks of your hands. Okay. If it's wet, yeah, that's a little bit different. The last thing, and I'll tell you, I'm a parent, and hopefully there's some more parents out there. Your nose is a wonderful weapon. If something doesn't smell right, it probably isn't right. The same thing applies with compost. If it smells funky, something's probably wrong. Usually if it smells funky, it hasn't finished composting, which means it's not ready to be used in your garden. Unfinished compost can actually pull nutrition away from your plants because the microbes that are breaking those materials down are working so hard, they're using some of the nutrients before they replace them back. So use that nose. If compost doesn't smell right, go find a different compost somewhere. If you're using your own compost from the backyard, same sort of thing. If your compost pile is stinky, then send me an email. We'll figure out what's going on with it. But compost shouldn't smell bad. It should not smell bad at all. Now, what are some of the benefits of organic matter? In our case, talking about soil structure, it helps soil particles to clump and form aggregates. That's our actual soil structure building. And by improving our soil structure, we're improving pore space, that porosity, which is improving aeration, it's improving drainage, and that can improve our water infiltration rates. It's also going to improve our water holding capacity. Improve, not necessarily increase, but improve. If we are able to hold the same amount of water, but we can release more of it to plants. Remember that clays can actually seal so tightly that water can't make its way in, but sometimes there's water bound so tightly in our soil profile that it can't be released to plants. Well, that water's no good to us as gardeners and landscapers. Organic matter opens the soil up so that water that's in there is more readily available. Now, this is more for our sandy soil folks than with clay soils, because we're not as worried about it with clay soils. But a 1% increase in soil organic matter equals roughly 27 gallons of water stored per acre. That's a big deal. You talk about holding water that we can then use for our plants later in the season. That's a big, big deal. Think of the money you can save on your irrigation bill if you're simply using the water that falls from Mother Nature. Okay. The other thing that organic matter does is it's going to improve your soil health. It's going to improve the health of your microbiome by supporting the micropopulation. Your soil's alive. It needs to be fed. Organic matter is what all those critters eat. And they produce a long-term source of plant nutrients. About 1 to 4% of soil organic matter becomes plant available per year. And that number, it flexes a lot based on climate, conditions, the activity of that population. But that organic matter can help feed plants. And those microbes that live down there, not only do they build soil, but they can also help fight disease. As I said, organic matter is going to help your plants thrive. So let's talk about expanded shale for a minute. Expanded shale is a one-time permanent soil addition for sticky, heavy clays. Okay, and that's not every clay soil. Not every garden that has clay in it needs expanded shale. And what expanded shale, it's just shale that's been cooked in a kiln. It's sort of jet puffed. It makes you look like a hoss when you're shoveling it because it's light as a feather, but you can sling shovelfuls of rocks and people think you're a beast while you're doing it. It's very lightweight. It's very porous. Don't add it to a sand. You've got more than enough drainage already. In a sand, instead of putting in expanded shale, I'd tell you to add just that same amount in compost. And the same somewhat applies for a clay soil. I only recommend expanded shale to folks if they have a very serious issue with standing water. And even then, sometimes standing water is caused because your drainage plan around your house has changed. So expanded shale is a tool for opening up our clay soils, but it's not always needed. Compost is what I would tell you to start with. Now let's talk about hardwood mulch. And this is sort of the third component to earth-kind soil management. Shredded hardwood mulch. Being shredded, it's going to knit together and form sort of a brush pile effect. So for those of you that can see me, you want it to be able to breathe a little bit. You don't want your mulch to pack so tightly that water struggles to make its way through it. We want water to be able to make its way through that mulch, work its way down into the soil. And then when we get into the heat of the summer, that mulch is going to help keep our soils cooler and and minimize evaporative losses. So we can, again, we're maximizing the water that we have in our soil and making the most of that valuable resource. 3 inches of mulch is ideal. Any more than that, you can actually wind up holding on to too much water. We don't want to rot off those roots that are down there. And for our woody perennials and trees, you want to leave at least 6 inches around the base of that plant because we don't want to hold too much moisture and wind up causing that plant to decline and die. Please don't use inorganic mulches. They really don't bring anything to the table except pain. Bless my neighbor who lives behind us. They've mulched with lava rocks, and I swear I can hear his roses sizzle every summer when the heat comes around. I understand some people don't want to have to, quote, refresh their mulch every year. You know, they just want something they can put down one time and forget about it. But we want to be topping that mulch up every year. All right. Ideally, we want about 1 inch of mulch breaking down every year. This is our future source of organic matter to our soils. Once you've worked that initial amount of compost in, we need to continue to add organic matter over time. Our mulch is the tool for that. We want that mulch to break down. Along with that, we want to try to disturb the mulch as little as possible. The microbes that live in the soil don't really like the sun. They don't like UV. So when we start disturbing mulches, we expose those and we do kill them off a little bit. No, I don't have numbers, but it's easily surmised by just try to leave your mulch alone as much as possible. And don't replace your mulch. Just cover it up with fresh mulch every year. Top it back up to 3 inches, and you'll be good. So a quick recap. Number 1 rule in a clay soil, add compost, add that organic matter. pretty much every opportunity that you can. I've yet to come across a soil type that really doesn't like having additional organic matter. You can use expanded shale if needed for clay soils. Please don't use it in a sandy soil. Exchange that expanded shale for additional compost. You guys with sands have plenty of drainage already. We're going to want to mulch to conserve water and add that organic matter in the future. If you guys want to learn some more about expanded shale, follow that link. Dr. Steve George, he brought Earthkind to the world. He's been in extension for, I think, somewhere around 40 years. Earthkind is his baby. He is the person that led the research that showed Earthkind is such a successful management strategy here in North Texas. And he did a wonderful video about expanded shale and how you should use it in a clay soil and when you should use it. And then if you want to watch me and Steve build an Earthkind soil in his backyard, watch that video. We did it by hand. He made me use the shovel for most of it. So I don't know how I feel about that, but whatever. I won't hold it against him. Again, please do not add sand. I really can't stress that enough. I understand there's a lot of information about adding sand to clays. AgriLife Extension does not recommend it. It does not always go wrong, but when it does, it's very difficult to fix. So our soils are hard enough. Don't add sand. Add compost instead. If you're going to be adding something, add that organic matter. So let's talk about soil sampling. We'll close with this because soil sampling is a very important component to managing any soil. It sort of falls into the category of you don't know what you don't know. How do you know what your plants need if you don't know what's already down there, right? And I tell new homeowners, whether they've just moved to the area or maybe they've never owned a house or managed a landscape, you can learn an awful lot about the ground you're walking on by taking a shovel to it and seeing what's down there. But what you're going to get from a soil sample from the AgriLife Extension Soil Lab down in College Station, number one thing is a nutrient analysis. So your basic routine analysis is always going to give you nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and those are our primary nutrients. You'll also get secondary nutrients, so calcium, magnesium, sulfur. For those of you dealing with heavy clay, you're probably never going to have to worry about having calcium because we have highly calcareous soils. We have calcium out the wazoo. So you get those as well. Then we do have the capability to test for micronutrients. Most of the time, if you're working in ground, not so much in a raised bed, but if you're in ground, generally we don't worry about micronutrients. They are used in such trace amounts, it's very difficult to become deficient in them. But the difference in price between the two is like $7. So still, I think the micronutrient analysis is something like $19. I have the form in a later slide I'll show you guys. So it's very economical and it's a good baseline to start with, but those two should get you going. You will also get pH. Now, remember earlier I had in one of the common complaints is our pH is too high. It's too high for certain plants. Blueberries, looking at you. If you want to grow some of those plants that don't like alkaline soils, don't try to grow them in our clay soils. Put them in a pot or put them in a raised bed where you have control over that media. Don't pull your hair out and don't stress trying to fight our clay soils. Work with them. Right plant, right place, guys. So don't worry about pH too much. We have a huge plant palette here in North Texas. But there are just a few plants that don't like it. As Chase said, things that grow here grow like the dickens, the ones that don't die. So the ones that want to die, we put them in a pot or a raised bed. You'll also get salinity. This can be very important for folks that are irrigating from well water. Our groundwater here in North Texas tends to be quite salty. And depending on the filters for the well, we can run into salt problems. Also understand a lot of fertilizers come in a salt form. So depending on the usage of the property, there could be some salt buildup from fertilizer usage, or if somebody's using manure, something like poultry litter, composted cow manure, sometimes those products can be very, very salty as well. So our soil lab will also test those products too. But you can see salinity if you're having issues. There is testing to give you organic matter content. Those tests are more expensive. We're getting into the $30, $40 range at this point. If you want to do that, cool. I find if you're going to be working in compost anyways, it's sort of a moot point. Same with texture. You can do soil texture by feel, and that's probably going to get you sorted as much as you need to. Again, if you're curious and you want to know, then go for it. Do it. Have fun. I'm a soil nerd. You can nerd out with me on your soil. I'm down. Soil sampling is a wonderful troubleshooting tool. Anytime I say anytime, that's a pretty strong qualifier. Majority of the time when folks email me with a plant-related problem, I'm going to ask them if they've had a soil test done because I want to rule out, is there a deficiency? Is there a nutrient deficiency somewhere? We start with the least exotic things first before we start moving into crazy stuff. Is there a toxicity? I mentioned salt problems with irrigation from well water. We also can have elevated levels of boron, which boron is a plant essential nutrient. It's a micronutrient. But it's very easy to become phytotoxic in excess, and we do have boron in our groundwater. So if we were seeing goofy, perhaps boron deficiency symptoms, then I might tell somebody to run a detailed salinity. This could tell you if you have an irrigation issue. It could also, there are certain interactions between pH and herbicide. Atrazine is the poster child for this. That if you're seeing herbicide symptoms, we might want to look at that pH and see if there could be something wacky going on with one of the products that's being used. So a soil sample is not a useless tool. It contains a lot of good information, and it's very, very economical. Understand that you want your soil sample to represent whatever area as a whole. Soils, while we might think that they're all the same, they have differences from area to area. And your yard might be different from your neighbor's yard. If anybody lives in a neighborhood, in a town, there's probably been some extensive dirt work that was done. So who knows, your topsoil might have been scraped away. My house in Greenville, Texas is perched on a little red hill. And I don't know a lot of red clay floating around Greenville, Texas. So I don't know where that came from. But what you want with your soil sample is a representative sample of the area as a whole. So imagine these squares are your front yard, let's say. You've got several different techniques for getting a representative sample, and it depends on what your goals are. And you could certainly sample areas that are distinctively different. So let's say you could sample your front yard and backyard separately. Or if you had flower beds in the front yard, or you had a distinctly shaded area, if there's distinct differences, you can make the decision whether or not you want to sample them separately. The easiest method is the grid, but what you can run into in large spaces is that's a lot of subsamples. The way Brad does this, he takes a bucket and a shovel, and I go around taking subsamples and putting them in that bucket. If you use the grid, generally that's the most accurate, but it can be quite time consuming. Then you have field averaging, and with field averaging, you make some assumptions that the area is relatively uniform. And essentially it's the grid minus a bunch of points. And it's the same idea. You take subsamples, it's about a double handful worth of soil, and put it in that plastic bucket. Management zones looks a bit like a golf course. Golf course is a good example. Do you manage the greens and the fairways and the roughs the same? Probably not. So would you send those samples together as a whole? No, because you'd want specific recommendations for each of those different zones. Okay. And then the last one is a site specific. So let's say you had one spot in your yard where you just can't get grass to grow and you don't know what is going on. Or maybe you have a specific spot in your garden where plants just don't thrive. They don't do well. That's where all your subsamples would come just from that affected area. Again, you still have your bucket. You're still putting those subsamples in it. Your sample that goes down to the lab, along with one of these forms, is going to be made up of a mixture of those soils. And you need about a pint worth of soil from that mixture. Okay? And I understand some folks say that's a lot of work to go to for that much soil. But the more accurate your soil sample is, the better results you're going to have. So these are the two forms. They're available online. I can send a link out to Helen, and we can get it out to you guys if you want. TAMU soil testing will find it for you. We have one for urban and home use, and we have one for ag use. You get the same analyses on both. The homeowner one on the left-hand side gives you results back in terms of 1,000 square feet as opposed to per acre. That's the chief difference. And if you want to do some napkin math, you can convert between the two if you want to. These are the different analyses that we can run. Number 1 and number 2 are about what most people need. That's going to get you started. $12 for the routine analysis, plus the shipping to get it down to the lab in College Station. Your results get emailed back to you, which makes it very convenient for you to just forward them on to your extension agent and go over them together if you need that. The micronutrients, again, that can be very helpful as well. Once you get beyond number 2, generally there's some sort of problem that we're checking out, that we're trying to figure out what's going on. So do a soil sample. You'll learn an awful lot. There's the 2 addresses. Again, they are on the forms. They are online. Send it to the lab. Don't bring it to us. We don't do it here in Collin County. It's down in College Station. So with that, I have pretty much taught y'all how to build an earth-kind soil, but I'm going to put it to you again in 6 easy steps. Number 1, let's say you're starting fresh. You're going to clear that area of undesired vegetation, and then you're going to work in 3 inches of expanded shale if you need it. If you don't need it, 3 inches of compost. Then if you want, you can do step 3 again and add 3 more inches. Otherwise, move on to step 4. You're going to crown those beds. And what crowning is simply, if you have the bed, and I don't know if y'all can really see me, but the center of that bed is going to be higher than it is on the sides. And what that's designed for is when you do have a big rain event, excessive water that can't make its way into the soil can flow off. That's so you don't flood out your beds. Then you install your plants. Go ahead and mulch those plants with 3 inches of shredded hardwood mulch. And then number 6, every year you top that mulch back up to 3 inches. With that, you'll have a happy, healthy soil with proper plant selection, which that's a topic of its own right. They will thrive. They will thrive. And I've got some pictures later on to prove it to you. But let's do some more word association real quick, because by now, I hope most of y'all are understanding that we've got a better palette of words we should be using with our clay soils. All right. They're resilient. They are very productive. They're useful. They're alive. That's a big red one. Happy and healthy. Thriving. Dare I say it? Love your soils. Here's some of the success you can have with EarthKind. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with Myers Park north of McKinney. My master gardeners, the Collin County master gardeners, do a wonderful job managing those gardens. It is a public park. Please come out and see us. We would love to show you around. We have work days, Mondays and Wednesdays, except when it's pouring rain. But come out, ask us questions, talk to us about EarthKind, talk to us about plant selection. We would be absolutely thrilled to talk to you guys. Our soils are a wonderful tool. We just need to put them to work for us. So with that, if anybody has any questions, I'll take them. I'll go ahead and put my contact information up there while we answer questions. Thank you, guys.
Okay, Brad, I think you might have changed a few opinions about our crazy clay soils.
Yes.
You do have several questions. And of course, if anyone else is on the live Zoom, please place your questions in the chat. Oh, they're coming in. Okay, so we had Robert had several questions for you. So I'm going to group Robert's questions together. Robert was curious about like soils used in garden boxes or raised beds. And if it, like, for example, what kind of soil should you use in those? And should he do a soil analysis if he has raised beds?
Good questions. So use a raised bed mix or a potting mix if you're going to be working with containers or raised beds. You can still mix compost into those. In fact, your plants will like it. Don't try to mix in native soil certainly not into containers. As I said, and believe me, I did this as a grad student. I tried using native soil in little plant cones to grow grasses, and it was a disaster. When you move our native soils into pots, they get ornery in a big way. They just do not behave the same way. They set like a rock. They crust over really heavily, so watering them becomes sort of a nightmare. So just stick with a commercially available raised bed mix, or a garden soil or a potting mix. And good point on the raised beds. I'd actually meant to mention this. So for those of you that I haven't convinced about our clay soils, if you don't want to enjoy the challenge of our clays, then play in a pot and play in raised beds. I know I have plenty of my master gardeners that they don't want to mess with our clay soils. So they put in raised beds and they don't worry about it. Should you get those soils tested? Absolutely. Because the same sort of thing, you don't know what your nutrient analysis is until you have it tested. And your plants are going to be using nutrients from that raised bed and from those containers. So I'd absolutely go ahead and get those tested, and see what you've got in there. Good question.
Okay, so Robert was also asking about the soil testing kits that you might see at a big box store. They might be a little bit more affordable than the $15-ish at for the test, through AgriLife. Do you have any, or have you heard if those kinds of over-the-counter tests are accurate?
How much did he say?
Well, on the website for the A&M thing, I saw it was about, you showed in your presentation, it's about $15, if you wanted to get A&M to test your.
My tired ears heard 1,500 and I was like, what, where? So with those in-store soil testing kits, what I have found and what my colleagues have found, they are not necessarily the most accurate things on the planet, especially not when it comes to pH. With using our soil testing lab, you get the confidence you are getting an accurate test. That's my main complaint that I have with the in-store testing, is that just accuracy is sort of all over the board. But that's really about all I've got to say. I'm not a big fan of those DIY test kits at home, because you can do that and do the work and still possibly be right back where you were and still not really having a good representation of what's down there.
Point taken. Okay, so Robert's last question was, how should he use perlite?
Perlite. Oh, so perlite. That's an interesting one. He's about to get the first extension. It depends. So if you're working in ground, I would tell you not to use perlite, mainly because it's so soft, you're just going to destroy it. You're going to wind up turning it to dust. Perlite is, you can sort of, I don't want to say you can use expanded shale and perlite interchangeably, because they're not the same beast, but they somewhat fall into the same role. Perlite is quite light. So you'll see it used a lot in potting mixes and things like that, because it is light. And in that case, I'd say if you're working in containers, cool. If you feel like you need to use a product like perlite or expanded shale and you're in ground, then I would use the expanded shale and not use the perlite. The expanded shale is probably actually going to be a little cheaper. I'm not totally sure on that. I don't have numbers, but I would think it would probably be a little bit cheaper in bulk. But as far as managing like a clay soil, I wouldn't recommend perlite. I'd use the compost or the expanded shale.
All right, good point. Okay. All right, so Cheryl had a couple questions. Cheryl asked, what is mulch composed of? Can we make our own? And are wood chips and even leaves typically used as mulches?
Yes. So mulch is essentially any shredded natural material. Mulch is, if you want to really define a mulch, anything that you put down that's going to help save soil moisture, regulate soil temperature. You've probably heard plastic mulching, where you've got big long row covers in intensive horticulture. We recommend shredded hardwood mulch. Dr. Steve George would tell you we're trying to emulate the native processes in a mature hardwood forest. So leaves, oh yeah, grind them up. They could absolutely be used in addition with the mulch. One thing with leaves, good strong wind, sometimes they wind up blowing everywhere. You're not going to see that with something like a shredded hardwood mulch. The hardwood mulch is going to knit together in a slightly more open than with leaves. But there's no reason why you can't use leaves in addition to that mulch. I have no problem with that. It's still a source of nutrients. They can take a long time to break down, but I don't have a problem with that. It's, in my eyes, that's still nutrition and still organic matter that our soils would love to have.
All right. So Cheryl also asked about making compost. So I know that could be an entire talk, and what I could do is looking at for scheduling that for a future Lunch and Learn is just having one session on making compost.
I love it. Love
just she has a couple other questions I think you can answer. Should animal manure be added as a compost ingredient? And do you recommend worm compost?
So adding manures, there's a few things with animal manures that you just need to be cautious of. I already touched on salinity, can be problematic. You can also run into things like excessive phosphorus with certain manures, which is a problem in our clay soils sometimes. That's more due to misuse of starter fertilizers that are high in phosphorus. But I would encourage you, one, if you're using animal manures, you need to know where it's coming from. If you're using manure, like something like Black Cow or any of the brands that are available in a big box store, I'm not really worried about those. But if you were, say, getting manure from a local producer, you need to ask the question what herbicides, if any, they are using, because we do have some herbicides. Heck, I use them on my own property that can be very persistent in compost, and you just need to be aware if those products are there. If you are using a manure, I would encourage you to actually put some in a pot and do some test germinations in it. And if your plants pop up and they look great and then they suddenly die, there might be something going on. So I typically tell folks not to mix manures into their compost. I'm not super duper against it. It's just plant-derived compost is the safer bet. You don't have to worry about those things. As far as worm compost, I'm fine with that too. If you want to use it, it's cool. Our research was done using plant-derived compost, which is why we recommend it that way. I don't mind if you want to use it, if you want to use the worm stuff, even the mushroom compost, that's fine too. I don't know of any research that really draws a comparison between all different types of compost. So no, that's fine.
All right, so the talk about compost has spurred some more questions. So Ruth is asking, what about using urine in compost?
No. And here's another one. We should have added this to the don'ts, but it's a different talk. Please don't use your own feces and your own waste or your pet's waste in compost. Don't use your own waste in your own garden. That's a good way to perpetuate disease. There's a reason that we don't have typhoid and cholera and things like that running rampant in the United States. So please don't do that. Yes, urea is a very, very good nitrogen source. It is very high in nitrogen. I use urea in the fertilizers I put on my own pasture. But please do not use urine. Don't use urine. Do not recommend.
That's a good point that there is a little bit of a difference there.
Yep.
All right. So we have a lot more questions, Brad. And just a reminder to everybody, if this session runs long or you need to leave early, this is being recorded. It will be posted on the NTMWD YouTube page, so you can catch up on all the Q&A. But we will continue running until Brad is done answering questions. So if you can stay, please. And if you need to go, absolutely. All right. So let's see. Melissa asked about gypsum, and is that a viable additive to clay soils?
It's a viable additive, but we don't need it. We don't need it. Add compost.
Okay. Well, okay. That was a nice and quick.
Yeah.
Answer.
Sorry. That's unless we want to turn everybody into soil chemists. Gypsum's not a good use of your finances. Sorry, that's your choice. But no, just stick with compost. And if you needed expanded shale, there's no need for gypsum.
All right, good. Let's keep it to the Texas two-step. We'll use compost and expanded shale. Okay. All right. So going along with this. So what about like tilling in leaves into your raised veggie beds? And also, would there be any negative aspect to using live oak leaves?
Well, so it's an interesting one because leaves take a long time to break down, especially live oak leaves as well. I mean, without getting really too deep into it, at the very minimum, if you were going to work them into your soil sort of quote raw, I would want you to grind them up first in some way, just to make those particles smaller. But really, I think you'd be better served composting them first rather than just working them straight into your soil.
That's a good
And that's just because, remember I talked about compost that's not finished. That process of breaking down uses nutrients that our plants also use. And in some instances, that compost, you sometimes mislabel. You hear a compost was hot. A compost was hot. I've heard it used in both vernaculars where it wasn't finished composting or it had too much salt in it and stuff, but it's more that product wound up actually harming the plants that were there rather than helping. So I would tell you to take those leaves and grind them up and compost them first, before you work them into your raised beds.
Okay. All right. So more compost questions for you.
Sounds
So-
like we need to do a composting
I
workshop,
think
and I'm game
so.
for that.
Okay, great. So give me some dates for March. Okay.
Sure.
So talking about composting, what about top dressing with composting? And
Yeah.
also, could you use compost instead of mulch, especially if you are container gardening?
Sure. So on the top dressing with compost, what I'll say, hey, plug for Dr. Becky Bowling, you need to come to Love Your Turf on the 14th, everybody, because Becky's going to give y'all the turf. She is the turf queen. Yes, you can top dress with compost. In fact, I would rather you top dress with compost than sand. Same sort of thing. Compost is going to provide nutrition, whereas sand it doesn't bring any of that to the table. Yes, you can. Again, that's another talk. But you can just, a lot of times that compost needs to be finely sieved. The particle size needs to be quite a bit smaller so that you can actually work it down to the soil surface. But I don't know, Becky might be talking about top dressing on the 14th. Get registered, come find out.
That's right. Good teaser. Thank you, Brad.
There you go.
All right. Let's see here. Do you recommend tilling soils before planting vegetables?
Man, now we're finding it depends. In all fairness, if you're in a vegetable garden, in ground, our natural soils, whether they've been amended with compost or not, you're probably going to have to till at least a little bit to make them soft enough for you to plant into. Excuse me. If you're in a raised bed where you're using a container mix or a raised bed mix, generally those are more friable, so they're easier to work and you probably won't need to. In ground, you're probably going to have to till at least a little bit. But you'll have, honestly, there's a little bit you're going to have to see if the ground is, honestly, if it's friable enough for you to work by hand, or if you're going to need to get like a rotor tiller out or something like that. The compost will help with that sort of thing. Your organic matter, it's a lot more forgiving than our mineral solids are. So having a good organic matter content will make our soils easier to work. There's still a limit to what we can do with clay soils. My colleague will say, sometimes when you're dealing with clays, you can't expect miracles. I would say be prepared to till more often than not. But you'll just have to see. And that's also dependent on moisture as well. If you wait till it's dry as a bone and hard as a rock, man, that's no fun. That's a beating. That's type 3 fun right there.
That is true. All right. So we had a couple questions from Susan. Susan is, she said, if I'm growing natives, do I need to add expanded shale or even compost? And she's assuming that the native plants know how to grow in our clay soils.
So that depends on the native plants. And that's one of the welcome to one of the joys of Texas being a really big place. We have a lot of native plants here. So if you're talking specifically to plants that have grown historically in the Blackland prairies, probably still going to want to work that compost in, because we broke that natural cycle of returning organic matter to it when we sort of tilled up the prairies. So our organic matter levels across the board are generally lower than where they probably were historically. I doubt you'll need the expanded shale. I don't think you'll need the expanded shale. But again, it's going to determine, if some of those plants have higher drainage requirements, they don't like wet feet, then there's always going to be some some what ifs. But yeah, still add the compost. Probably won't need to expand it yet.
Okay. And then she was also had a question about mulches. What are your thoughts on about green mulch, such as ground covers versus hardwood mulch?
So our research was done for Earthkind. Our research was done with shredded hardwood mulch. In a landscape setting, it might be difficult to get away with using green mulches. Overall, I think green mulches are beneficial. They are good. One of the main, and this is just general soil conservation practices, guys. We want to try to avoid bare earth whenever we can. Bare earth is just erosion waiting to happen, whether that's from the wind or from rain events with runoff. So plant materials and mulches help hold soil in place. Green mulch is a good thing. They're sort of a subject for a different matter, a different day, but with this, green mulches in a landscape setting are tougher to manage, balance them out with the landscape plants that are there. And even then, that's before you even run into HOA requirements and some of the other fun stuffs of managing an urban landscape. So my recommendation, if you're in town per se, would be to stick with a shredded hardwood mulch. Probably not going to hear about it. But then experiment with using green mulches, say in a backyard somewhere where nobody's going to get onto you if they don't know what you're doing, and see how that works out for you. I don't know to the level that green mulch has been researched in urban landscaping, ornamental landscaping. Maybe that's a gap we need to start thinking about. I shall write that on a sticky note for future reference.
And add it to all your other sticky notes you have up there?
I have managed to reduce the number of sticky notes, guys. It's Brad's analog reminder system, but it works like a dream.
All right. Okay. So we also, so everybody, we're winding down. So if you have any questions, this is your last call for questions for Brad. So we had a question about worms and like the worms relationship with the soil. And are there certain worms that are better than others to have in your soil? So Susan seems to have noticed that she has small, slow worms, but she's also seen some fast moving, longer worms in her soil. And she just wants to make sure, like, are all worms friends?
So there are a few worms that are not friends. There are some invasive ones in here. I'm not an expert on what those are, but we do have some invasive species of worms that we don't like. But for the most part, earthworms are our buddies. And in fact, if you go outside today, I bet you will find a ton of them because the soil is flooded and they've come up to the surface to breathe. Earthworms are, I'm sure we've all remember in elementary school, we talk about worms. Worms are good. Worms live in the soil. They eat dirt. They're good for dirt. It really is the case. They are sort of unsung heroes. Not only do they move organic matter around in the soil. Think about our mulch breaking down and you have that fresh compost on the surface. Well, what critters do you think are going to be moving that stuff through the soil? Earthworms, other worms, larger fauna that live in the soil. They have the ability to take those materials and move them further down into the soil profile. Remember, soils are dynamic. This is a part of that. As they're working their way through the soils, they're also cutting pathways. They are building structure too. They're creating pathways where water can flow, where air can reside, and where plant roots can grow. Worms are great. One of the things I will tell you, you really don't need to go out and buy worms to add. In fact, I would encourage you not to. I think there's a better usage of your money than that. If you've ever watched Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. They will. They're down there. Feed your soil. Feed your soil that organic matter. You will have the earthworms that you need. I'll tell you, I had some old pots that my wife and I grew tomatoes in last year, and I tucked them in a back corner of our backyard, and they had drainage holes cut in the bottom. I was getting those pots out this past weekend and was moving some soil around. The earthworms had moved in through the drainage holes in the bottom of the pots. So if you build it, they will come. So don't worry about adding your own earthworms and that sort of stuff. Add that organic matter and you will get those worms.
All right, fantastic. Okay, so this is going to be, I did see that we had a few more questions about compost in the chat, but we're going to save that for when Brad comes back to talk to us specifically about compost. Yeah. Okay, so this is going to be our last question. This is from Jacqueline. So Jacqueline her soil has a bad pill bug infestation, and they're eating her new transplants. Is there a reason that, is there a reason not to do a soil drench with permethrin to get rid of the pill bugs?
Are we sure it's the pill bugs that are eating those plants? Because that would be sort of interesting to me. Honestly, what I would have her do is shoot me an email and we can talk about that. Because normally pill bugs are good
Yes.
things. They're going to be breaking down, leaf litter, and those they're a detritivore typically. So they're eating those sort of dead materials. I haven't really.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it's the pill bugs because I came out, I had planted my transplants and early in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, they were just covered with the bugs and
That's so strange.
they were pretty much eaten down to the ground.
That's weird. Shoot me.
The roly-poly bugs is what I'm talking about.
Shoot me an email. Let's talk about that and figure it out.
Okay. So you think really mostly pill bugs are good for the soil then?
Yeah, for the most part they are, because they're busy munching on, they're one of the larger critters that break organic matter down into smaller pieces that then our microorganisms work on as well. So usually they're part of the reason that I try anytime, and this is an earth-kind practice as well, we're trying to minimize the usage of pesticides wherever possible, whether that's a fungicide, herbicide, insecticide. And what that comes down to is essentially building a healthy environment that takes care of itself. So I try to discourage folks from doing soil drenches whenever possible, because there's tons of good stuff that lives in the soil that we don't want to target. But sometimes we got to do what we got to do. So yeah, shoot me an email and we'll talk about that and try to figure out what's going on.
Okay.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you, everybody, for spending your hour with us here today. As a reminder, we do have a class on February 14th with Dr. Becky Bolin, the turf queen, talking about how to love your lawn. You can find the information about that and more of our classes at ntmwd.com/classes. And there's also links to replays of all the classes we've had since we started this series. So thank you so much, everybody. I got everybody's names for the drawing for the card kit. And thank you so much, Brad, for your expertise today. And we'll talk later.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody. Y'all take care.
Thank you, everyone.